You ever notice how some people don't panic when things fall apart? The power goes out, the plan collapses, nobody's responding, and instead of spiraling, they just pause, assess the situation, and quietly start fixing things. No announcements, no speeches, just action. If you've seen that person, chances are they're Gen X. Generation X is one of the most talked around generations and one of the least talked about. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, they're often described as cynical, emotionally distant, or permanently unimpressed. But those labels are surface level. What's really going on underneath is far more interesting and far more human. Gen X didn't grow up in a world designed to catch them when they fell. They grew up in what psychologists call a high-contingency environment. That's a fancy way of saying outcomes depended heavily on your own actions. If you forgot your keys, you waited. If you missed the bus, you figured it out. If something broke, you didn't Google it. You stared at it until it made sense. Many Gen X kids were latchkey kids, home alone after school, parents working, no constant supervision, no emotional play-by-play, and that shapes a brain in a very specific way. When support is limited, self-reliance becomes automatic, not heroic, just necessary. Over time, their nervous systems learned something crucial: don't assume rescue is coming, assume you are the rescue. That's why Gen X often feels psychologically older than their years. They learned early to regulate themselves, to tolerate uncertainty, and to solve problems internally before looking outward. This is where their reputation for defensive pessimism comes from. They don't expect the best-case scenario, they expect what's realistic. But here's the twist: defensive pessimism isn't negativity, it's preparation. When Gen X imagines what could go wrong, they're not catastrophizing, they're rehearsing. Their brains run quiet simulations so they're not caught off guard. It's why they often seem calm in crises. They've already visited the worst-case scenario in their mind and survived it there first. Another defining trait is how they relate to authority. Gen X doesn't automatically respect titles, they respect competence. If you know what you're doing, they're with you. If you don't, no position or speech will save you. That mindset comes from watching institutions wobble. Corporations downsized loyal workers, leaders contradicted themselves. Promises were made loudly and broken quietly, so Gen X adapted. Their trust became conditional, observational, evidence-based. They don't ask who's in charge, they ask who actually knows what they're doing. This also explains their work ethic, which is often misunderstood. Gen X doesn't like performative productivity. They don't want to talk about working hard, they want to work hard and go home. Achievement for them is private. Competence is demonstrated, not announced. They're the kind of people who fix the problem without telling anyone there was a problem in the first place. And because they don't self-promote, their contributions are often invisible, but entire systems quietly rely on them. Psychologically, Gen X is also comfortable with solitude in a way that feels foreign to younger generations. They remember boredom, real boredom, hours of nothing. And instead of being rescued by endless content, their minds learned how to wander, invent, and self-entertain. That's a big deal. Boredom is where problem-solving muscles grow. It's where you learn to sit with your thoughts without escaping them. Gen X didn't just tolerate solitude, they trained in it. So when newer generations feel anxious without constant connection, Gen X often experiences silence as neutral, sometimes even soothing. Their sense of self doesn't disappear when nobody's watching. Emotionally, Gen X tends to process feelings internally first. This is sometimes misread as emotional distance, but it's more accurate to call it emotional containment. They don't broadcast feelings while they're still raw. They want to understand them before sharing, if they share at all. This comes from growing up in a culture that didn't center emotional validation. Feelings were real, but they weren't always discussed. So Gen X learned to compress emotion, carry it, and keep functioning. The upside is resilience. The downside is that vulnerability can feel unfamiliar, even risky. One of the most underrated traits of Gen X is how they collaborate. Quietly, they don't need group chats or recognition ceremonies. They help, fix, support, and step back. If you thank them too loudly, they might get uncomfortable. This isn't humility theater. It's a deep belief that doing the job matters more than being seen doing it. And when you compare Gen X to younger generations, the contrast becomes clear. Millennials and Gen Z grew up in lower contingency environments. More safety nets, more guidance, more explanation. That doesn't make them weaker, it makes them different. Gen X understands what it's like to figure things out with limited tools, to fail without an audience, to succeed without applause. That experience gave them practicality over idealism and adaptability over optimism. And here's where Gen X becomes something unique. They're a bridge. They understand the analog world, patience, permanence, delayed gratification. And they adapted to the digital world, speed, change, constant updates. They translate between generations without making noise about it. They don't romanticize the past or worship the future. They live in what works. As Gen X ages, something interesting is happening psychologically. The armor is still there, but it's softer, not because they're weaker, because they've earned the right to rest. They're beginning to integrate independence with connection, competence with care. If you're Gen X, here's the truth. That realism isn't bitterness, it's wisdom. That self-reliance isn't coldness, it's survival. And that quiet presence you bring into rooms, people feel it even if they don't name it. Generation X doesn't shout its strength, it demonstrates it, over and over, calmly, reliably, without asking for credit. And maybe that's why they're so easy to overlook and so hard to replace. If this made you see Gen X or yourself a little differently, sit with that for a moment. Reflection is kind of their thing. And if you want to keep exploring how different minds are shaped by different worlds, you already know where to be.